And if you consider what happened with carrot supplies, there was a 2-week 50% decline year on year in terms of supplies. But it was quite interesting how even after moving into March and in April, even though volumes recovered, prices were still year on year on high rates. They were trending on high rates. And it just, again, alludes to the point of price stickiness.
Vegetable prices have been rising higher than consumer price inflation. This is one of the trends highlighted in the latest edition. It's the spring edition of Absa's AgriTrends report. And to help us make sense of it, two of the bank's leading economists. Thanks for joining me, ladies. Yeah, you are among the leading economists. So vegetable CPI, as I've alluded, exceeded the headline CPI inflation. Very basic. Why was that?
So that was due to supply side disruptions. So we saw heavy rains earlier in the season that caused harvests to be delayed and some quality issues both in the Northern Cape and in Western Cape, particularly for carrots and onion. So those supply side disruptions translated to price increases that were quite sticky in the market, so they remained there for quite some time, even when prices normalized. So, but what's encouraging with our point of departure for the rest of the year is that we do expect supplies to start normalizing, so prices are expected to come down for most of the vegetable categories. But it obviously depends on the category.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ntsani touched that some of the major contributors were onions and carrots. And I think carrots is a very interesting example alluding to that price stickiness. So if we get into the crux of it, what happened late February where we experienced heavy rainfalls? I think we saw flood reports in specific regions, but we started seeing these heavy rainfalls late February moving into March. And if you consider what happened with carrot supplies, there was a 2-week 50% decline year on year in terms of supplies. But it was quite interesting how even after moving into March and in April, even though volumes recovered, prices were still year on year on high rates. They were trending on high rates. And it just, again, alludes to the point of price stickiness. Another commodity that was impacted was also beetroot. I saw lettuce also contributed to that. But just to sum it up, climate variability, is becoming quite an important player within vegetable production in South Africa, because it does sort of dominate how supply side dynamics do impact prices.
So we briefly touched on onions and potatoes, but I'm wondering if there are specific trends that you wish to highlight. What's happening? What are you saying?
So onions and potatoes are quite significant commodities in terms of vegetables, and they do portray an inverse relationship. So if the one commodity's prices are up in one season, in that particular season, the other one will supplement with an inverse relationship. So what we've seen in 2024, we had that very conversational Black Frost event in July that had a negative impact in terms of potato supplies the previous season. As a result, we saw a momentous increase in potato prices, and that was primarily driven by negative market sentiment, panic buying. But in this particular season, we haven't experienced such adverse or such negative climatic conditions. And as a result, we have been able to supply more potatoes. It's also supplemented by the fact that, there's a Sandveld region. So your potato production is not concentrated in one region. So that risk is spread out. But again, that event that happened last year for the Black Frost, it actually caused some producers to plant more because of the losses experienced and market sentiments driving prices quite high. The fear for this season was what would happen if we experienced another frost event. So they planted more, and there wasn't a frost event, and as a result, there's a market oversupply. So prices have been trending on a downward trend. As of mid-August, I think we're sitting at very, very low potato price rates. Average prices were ranging around 3,900 per ton. I think the last time we saw such low prices was back in 2022. But the inverse is happening in terms of onions, right? So they had quite a low price season the previous season. That was due to a market oversupply, but they have reduced their plantings. They reduced it in the previous season for this current season. So there was a market shortage, and that's what has been driving onion prices upwards. I think looking forward, at this moment, Limpopo is doing quite well because it's supported by these favorable climatic conditions. So a lot of volume is expected from Limpopo, which might keep your average seasonal prices lower for potatoes. But I think onions are doing quite well. And Botswana coming in and pulling some of that product in a demand form, we are anticipating seasonal average onion prices to average higher than they did in 2024.
Another factor that's been impacting vegetable production, or at least some of the trends, is our relationship with some of our neighbors, particularly Botswana and Namibia. We've seen some bans and all sorts of trade situations and problems there that has impacted local markets, Zama.
Yeah, that's true. So I think pre-2025, I think we were sitting at an import ban from Botswana. Botswana is quite an important market, specifically if you're considering your major vegetable commodities such as potatoes and onions. So in the previous season, where we experienced a bit of a market oversupply coming from a high base, in terms of prices, pre-2024, the onion market experienced quite an oversupply, and then prices were under pressure. But that pricing pressure was also perpetuated by the fact that we didn't have exports to Botswana. So in this season, what we've seen, gates opened for vegetable exports to Botswana, and we saw a demand pull a little bit from that country, and that supported current season onion prices. So what happened in this season is that there was a reduction in supplies, but that demand pull from Botswana also assisted in terms of prices. I think if you consider what's happening with Namibia, we are still negotiating very similar to the USA. But what Namibia has been doing in terms of vegetable exports is that they do periodic pauses and bans. So based on economic conditions within their country, and which commodities they require more supplies of or less of, they will then it's a pause and play. So in certain months, you will see, like at the moment, we're currently allowed to export carrots, lettuce, cucumbers. But if you consider commodities such as onions, we're currently on a pause. So it's based on how they are conducting their economic trade in order to regulate what's happening for them domestically, because they raised it quite well. The same issue that Botswana had, to say, we're not going to continue importing from South Africa if it distorts our producers' margins and it dysregulates our domestic economy. So they are similar to China, very inward looking. And you cannot blame them for trying to protect the economy. But we do note that it does have negative impacts in terms of what we've seen in the previous season to South Africa. So I think a roundtable discussion is warranted to just make sure that, is there a way that we can have continuous exports to those regions, because they're quite important players in how they drive prices in our commodity markets in terms of fish.
So many behind-the-scenes conversations are happening between the Department of International Relations, Department of Agriculture, and our neighbors. Kenzie, maybe in closing, your take on the import bans?
Not particularly on the import bans, but maybe just the increased protectionism coming in, and this we saw after COVID-19. So it opened a lot of countries' eyes, So it comes from a place of recognized vulnerability and seeing how they and everyone else in the world can protect their local industries. But I think what remains important for the vegetable industry is monitoring those input costs. As well as climate variability is quite an important consideration, but also seasonal supply dips and spikes. So that continues to be what drives our conversations and what structures conversations going forward. But yeah. Okay.
As they say in the movies, watch this space. It will be interesting to see the impact of this increased protectionism on vegetable production in South Africa. Of course, the full report on vegetable production and the latest trends now available in Absa's Spring edition of the AgriTrends report, now available for download on most platforms. Stay tuned. Be on the lookout for our next conversation, which will be on ESG and some of the water dynamics impacting the agricultural sector in South Africa.